Easily distinguished by its kick drum and syncopated hi-hats, the infectious rhythm of house music has dominated clubs and dance floors across the world. It is the original electronic dance music, EDM. Its birth in Chicago in the late 70s marked the start of a new era in music. Since then, house has developed and evolved so much, creating new genres such as techno, drum and bass, acid house, and much more. With such drastic changes in the past 40 years, it's vital that we don't forget where these sounds originated from and the historical and cultural weight these tracks carry. This is the history of house, how the popular music genre found its origins within the oppressed communities of Chicago. Today, house is enjoyed by everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. But in 70s America, certain genres had particular stereotypes or expectations attached to both the artist and the listener. For example, rock music was seen as heterosexual, listened to by predominantly white men. But disco was black, it was Hispanic, it was queer, and disco was where house all began. To understand just how significant segregation in music was, we need to take a look at one event in particular: disco demolition. See, in the late 70s, disco was everywhere. Every radio station was playing it. It was seen as an end produce of the social movements that spread across America in the 60s. It was a sound that brought people together. Quickly, people came to identify disco with black, brown and queer communities who they imagined to be benefiting from its popularity. This backlash against disco was coined discophobia, and it soon manifested its way into becoming a physical movement. Mike Veeck, promotional manager of the White Sox and son of the owner of the White Sox, saw an opportunity to profit from discophobia. Partnering up with Chicago's classic rock station, WLUP, known for its Christian contemporary format, the White Sox held a pro-rock anti-disco night at the ballpark, which became known as Disco Demolition Night. Attendees would be allowed to enter the White Sox playing ground, Comiskey Park, for just 98 cents, but you also had to give up a disco record. 60,000 people attended that night, way more than the stadium could actually hold. After the first game of the night, WLUP's radio DJ Steve Dowell drove onto the field, dumping a load of disco records and setting them on fire. The crowd went wild, storming the field, rioting. The second game of the night had to be cancelled due to the crowds. Steve Dowell insisted that this reaction was race-neutral cultural preference and not a homophobic or racist cultural statement. Disco Demolition Night was a pretty good marker in history to signify the end of disco's popularity. But now, record stores across the nation had an abundance of cheap disco records, and less than a decade later, would the genre have its revenge. You see, at the time, spaces for black, brown and queer people in which they could party and enjoy themselves were slim. Having a space where these groups could meet, share ideals, enjoy similar tastes in music was vital for development within their communities. We can see how important having a shared space is throughout any subculture's history. One space in particular became infamous for its open, relaxed, welcoming parties: the Loft. David Mancuso, a 60s seeker, was having a self-searching crisis when he began throwing LSD-inspired parties in his New York apartment in the late 60s. These parties soon attracted many like-minded individuals and young people of different races and sexes who came to enjoy the unique sounds played in the Loft. Afro and Latino beats, R&B, danceable rock mixed ideals and people together. As musician and producer Nile Rodgers said,
"The music is just a reflection of the culture. It's a microcosm of what's actually happening out in the world."
The Loft was only the beginning of dance music spaces. In 1977, The Warehouse opened on 206 South Jefferson Street, Chicago, Illinois. It opened as a private gay club for people looking for an after-hours event when all the other clubs would close. It kept an autonomous status by not serving alcohol. This drew crowds of young people of all different ethnicities and sexualities who came looking for these new psychedelic sounds played across all three levels of The Warehouse. One man in particular mastered the sound of The Warehouse: Frankie Knuckles, aka the Godfather of House. Frankie had been a regular attendee of Mancuso's apartment back in the Loft, but had been drawn to Chicago by an opportunity as a DJ for the Warehouse. Frankie utilised the vast amounts of disco records that had been abandoned and a drum machine to create his own sound, replaying the best parts of his disco tracks over and over. Tracks went for as long as 8 to 10 minutes, and the people loved it. Frankie called house music disco's revenge. He began handing out cassettes of his mixes, which spread throughout Chicago like wildfire. Frankie Knuckles was the sound of house. In the mid to late 80s, a pattern appeared within dance tracks in Chicago, a pattern that set the criteria for what was considered house music. Many credited Your Love by Frankie Knuckles and Jamie Principle to be the first house track. Other infamous tracks such as On and On by Jesse Saunders made waves across Chicago, becoming great examples of how disco could be reconstructed. Even today, disco tracks are still used in creating house music. Black female vocals are everywhere in house, taken from disco, R&B, soul tracks. They're reworked, repeated, pitched up, but still hold that identifiable soulful gospel sound. Some artists still opted to do their own vocals to their house tracks in the 90s, such as the infamous Gypsy Woman by Crystal Waters or Show Me Love by Robin S. Two female black artists whose records are still played throughout clubs today. Although not as common today, there are still DJs who do their own vocals, such as Dublin's own Jazzy. After the warehouse closed in '82, several other spaces opened up just like it, such as the Music Box and the Power Plant, both black-owned clubs. Now that there was more spaces for these communities, more DJs were needed, and evidently, new sounds were created along with them, like DJ Ron Hardy at the Music Box, who had a fast-paced, hard set-up house influenced by his heroin addiction. As the 90s came around, house had hit the mainstream audiences. DJs had realised there was more money in producing and selling records than there were playing in nightclubs, and so house music exploded onto the scene. Soon, people took to trying out house music themselves, and an abundance of white DJs quickly appeared onto the scene, overshadowing the black artists who had built the genre. Artists such as Daft Punk or Pete Tong became the faces of culturally black and queer sounds, making the genre more palpable and appealing to straight white audiences. Today, as it stands, the house music scene has become somewhat lost. Many of the legends and pioneers of house music still play and produce today, like Kerry Chandler or Jesse Saunders, but the scene has changed audiences, now appealing to mostly white, middle-class people on big party islands that cost thousands to attend. Today's DJs have lost sight of what house really is, a genre that was forced to be underground and exclusive due to racial and homophobic backlash, a genre that was created off the backs of socially conscious young people of New York and Chicago who wanted spaces for their ideals to flourish. House music is not just party music, but a genre that breathed life into a city desperate for culture.